Sanje Cheta Soje Chana Chanju Padu Dani Jasoje Dagwe Jeje Sana Drola Penje Sanje Drubo Sho Sanje Cheta Soje Chana Chanju Padu Dani Jasoje Dagwe Jeje Sana Drola Penje Sanje Drubo Sho Sanje Cheta Soje Chana La Chanju Padu Dani Jeje Sananje Drola Penje Sanje Drubo Tadala Meda Mianji Ambodan Jajala Soje Chala Shawa Chapana Sanje Sundara Shinji Deva Juru Juba Teta Tenje Zempe Chin Dene Dire Te Jajan Dere Jesavi Jeba Tenje Jeba Dala Chodu Da Jongo Yedi La Benye Jesha Sunsa Me Ambi Dani Lava Tula Tebesnya Yen Namola Yoga Dangdan Janga Rupoda Nigarana Wagani Tanji Watamja Kedo Dagiti Joe Congitan Jova Yoga Me Bakim Bachapam O me Batu Pata de Metin Medo Nishi Sidam Bazo Sanjamana Sambade La Cha Lo says Oh Yada that Loben Papaki Kashi Gave Chubai Kawa Chame Chitone Tini Mombe Sonam did Junsa Tamam Misoba Regime Linjin Tombani Laba Tombe Latonsin Gaji Legi Lame Bachina Chinayan Tomajuru Chani Dasuana Shin Kashi Gave Chubi Miri Serikara and Tande Maranzu and Tanjoji Dan Sambo Toa de and Serangama Kawane and Kasure then did that object could use a sabal than a shawari, Sakasi Gavach, Chuba, Kawatami, Tomas. Tender with that, then take any talk, Kasura Tenchawa, or Negata Tatu Ten Kandi, Mundo, Tarba, and a Tamja Chambala Sawaki, Kani, the Karasurus and a Kandeji Dunaya, do Tuagi, and then the Chabaji Lane. Then Chabaji Lane, and then the Chela, and it or Tendery, and it or Tabata Tanja Juba Tabata Shabak, and it son of Misopa. Or Kawachi Min Chitona, Tanya Mombe Sonam de Junsatam Misona, or Dinita, then the Tabate Temichis Sunday. City Pinzo and it ended up all court there. And it mandala Yawachima only Lizana topical Toba Chikuala Tem Mishepa Tamjatan Tabata Tamja Chamba Tara show. And then we do only Lizanam Dubaki and it Juzola Mission by the what that Sungari. Oh, Kajutana Paruchi Basaj, Ijimubula, and then Jimis, what Tendery to Casa Sonam Misoba, and then Jinjim, the Minamni, Sushi did the Jambeche, Sigana, Tendery, and that person saw a Tendeji to Toyaki, then the Tola, and it Yuzosanam Mazuba. Or Tendawati, Rimbochi, Lindo. Ani Lubulianga singing. Ani Lubu Marian by any by Temegi, any by Temegi Chava Daddy, any Churang Lunga Lobala, Labatomba Laton to Chuanashire, said Jisungua, Kashika, Chubi, Mikawa Tame Chidona, Tini Mombe Sonam, Susan Misona, Regin Tombani, Rabal Tomba Lato sings. Gujilam Gilame, but Chine and Tomajuru said, and I go make it Jubonga to the Mena, Mandala, make it Jubonga to the Mena, and only Luden, and the Chabatam did it in a Tom Dubai in or Dalias of Derbashi, Chijala, Mandalaya, and then a little only Chabajan to work it into any basic Chugure. So,
as it says in a verse by Master Aryashura, The essence of this verse is that when we've achieved a kind of wonderful life like this, which is a basis for all good fortune, and we're rich in virtue at this moment, if we waste it without utilizing it properly, then we're similar to someone who has traveled to an island that's rich in jewels, but has returned from that island of jewels with empty hands. In brief, the verse reads something like that. So the meaning of that is that at this moment in time, we've achieved a life in which is the result of a great deal of virtue that we created in the past. In order to achieve a human life like this, which is endowed with the freedom to practice dharma and is free from all of the defects which would prevent us from being able to do that, then this necessarily had to arise out of the specific causes that give rise to it, which are the practice of virtue. So this kind of condition that we've achieved now is sort of like the person who's gone to that island and has all of that wealth sort of right in front of them. But if, on the other hand, we have this opportunity now, but if we don't utilize it and instead waste this life, so there are multiple ways to waste it. At the very least, we need to employ this kind of life to strive to ensure that we achieve a life like this in the next life. Our next life can be at a minimum. We need to secure a life in one of the upper realms of existence, a higher status of existence, such as we have now. Because if we waste this current life and don't even, at the very minimum, do what's necessary to ensure that we achieve a good life in the next life, then we'll be just like that person who went to like a trader or someone who went to an island that's rich in jewels, but then came home with absolutely nothing in their hand and is completely impoverished as a result of that. So at the moment we have a kind of life where it serves as a foundation for being able to develop even high achievements such as liberation from samsara and the achievement of Buddhahood. It serves as a platform basis for that kind of development. But if we don't ensure that we achieve even just at minimum a basically good life such as we have at present in the next life, then it's absurd to talk about higher achievements such as Buddhahood and liberation, because we won't even achieve a basically good life. We'll instead fall into the lower realms of existence. The reason for that is that at the moment, this current existence that we have has as its sort of substantial or material cause the virtue that we created in the past. But this is a result that we're experiencing now. So when that result is exhausted, the force of that karmic positive karma that we created in the past is exhausted, then this result will be extinguished. And so what we need to do in the present is to create more virtue by engaging in virtuous kinds of behavior and establish the kind of cause, a substantial cause for the achievement of a good rebirth in the next life. The basic way in which we do that is by avoiding the 10 kinds of non-virtue. That's the sort of minimum requirement that is necessary to practice in the current life.
Oh yeah, then the in that castle, only the cabajan, then they told me Ghana. And then the turn about Tigana. And that castle, Nelly Tabata Tanjaship Kwambang. And then do go on. Nelly Tabata Tanjaship, Tabata Kwambang Duba Chebalaya, and then do Jiggy Lamashia Gueva. Tell I, and it out. 联系코와 주도 그人바시데 시와데 다 개체시의 영장 안에 참만남这个告诉人바시라 되나 코와 주도 그人바데 나가 가서 리베 때라 바바 인장我听인장 안에 체도 잡아 섬제 탐제도 토자라 나면 바야다 보고 산제주 공부를 뭐지 진짜 토바차 네 치도 대두비 아니다 코와 주바다 도비人바라 소비 아니 남디다 아니 공부 쳐봐서 시후 튀어고와 시고와 제가 안에 튀어고와 안에 듣다 아니 생년 배고나다 마 운동 되지 거나서
So now we have as our ultimate objective the achievement of Buddhahood, to achieve that sort of high status of perfect awakening, enlightenment. It's necessary to become free from samsara, and both of those goals are predicated on the achievement of a good kind of rebirth, which is a basis for their development, for cultivating them. So that's kind of the point of that verse. Then again, is at the very minimum we need to, if we want to strive towards the achievement of full awakening, we have to have as a minimum requirement this achievement of a good rebirth. Now, in order to achieve the higher goals of enlightenment, a perfect awakening of Buddhahood, as well as, and even before that, the freedom from samsaric suffering, we have to understand how samsara operates, and particularly how samsara, from the one side, how samsara originates. The suffering of samsara is samsara, and then the origination of that, the causes that give rise to it. We have to understand that process, as well as the way in which we can achieve freedom from samsara, and the methods by which we can actualize that freedom from samsara. So the two sides of the Four Noble Truths, the side of contamination and the other side of purification, the second two of the Four Noble Truths, we have to understand how those operate together. And then, so this is laid out in ultimately from a Mahayana perspective, although it's often presented in a way which is common to the non-Mahayana practice of the path within the teaching here of the Pramanavarttika, or explanation of valid cognition. And so, in order to practice these things, we first have to understand them. And so that's the purpose of this, what we're doing here today. And so we need to set our motivation in that way, thinking that I'm going to listen to these teachings on this subject so as to understand them to the extent that I can, and as a means to being able to develop an understanding of how the path works so that I can pursue it towards the ultimate achievement of complete perfect awakening. Basically, you think to yourself, in order to achieve unexcelled true perfect awakening for the sake of all sentient beings, I'm going to listen to these teachings in order to understand the path as it's laid out here.
가상칸이 안에 가서를 여기 고라 안에 가서를 참말 저 졸라 편셔와 땜바디 시쪽 세이가라 아니다 되게 또 뒤지당 아니 이제 제가 도마 컴바 맞으면 매와다 제가 아니 이제 제가 도마 컴바 이제 봐라 아니 컴바 매와다 제가 같이 매비치 세이가라 아니 제가 같이 매바 생각을 로도 가야게 제가 같이 집에 따뜻도 마당 아니 가서래 아니 이제 탐에도 폐와 마와 매비 저방 다 뒤져 다 가서 서로지 마치마치 그봐 다 단다 뒤에 주고대 된도가 돼 그봐 된도가 가서 뒤 주고대 와 뭐야 어디 아니 저와다 셔를 골로대다 아니 좋아니 된지 공부를 주나 하세 아니 맞아 땡땡바당 검제지야라 당에 만들어봐 공부를 주나 체제도 가야 매내와 마인데 체제도 가야 내와 미대바 마인데 권해콘도 배워 저와 체제도 내와 미대디 진짜 가르래세나 랑게 리딩아마人让阿妈也sa边狂年狂多，这是让阿妈给sa边狂年狂多，陪我建议，俺那什么原来的。 是吧？什么原因人比我这个主代吧呀？你他提前了，他监控把了这帮，你年龄人这拍完了这帮也很多，是吧？这看上电影吧？张你说？哦。没事。什么很多对不对？看上去我带的。
什么对对？Yeah. I don't think so. No, that's what I'm. Didn't do the. 가성이 didn't do the.
很多年是，很多年这话是写到了所有落着的，就话你点就看吧，就那财检都看，财检都看样，你没点嘛，没带的，看给钱呐，就这样看给钱呐，这时候人给人家俺妈就对俺妈给俺妈来带呢。俺们给随便了带呢，就钱话了带呢，空都拍我钱去，俺这什么原因的？
Do you find that?
No.
No.
这多啊
？Sorry. Again, I'm not finding this. There's a summary that is being presented that we went over yesterday, but I'm not finding that particular phrase.你等解。So, okay. I don't think we actually went over that yesterday, but I might be mistaken. Okay. So this is in front, actually on page 312 in the translation. The summation of the topic that we arrived at the point to review a little bit. The point here is in the way in which the establishing the Buddha as a person who is an avenue of valid cognition or an authority is presented in the Pramanavarttika is by listing those 5 epithets that he is a being who has become an avenue of valid cognition or a source, an authority, a source of valid cognition. The Buddha is a person who has the desire, the wish to help living beings or migrating beings. He's the teacher, he's the Sugata, and he's the protector or savior. So this is that's the forward presentation of demonstration of how the Buddha is a authoritative person, and then in the reverse process you infer from the fact that he is a savior, that he is the Sugata, from the fact that he's the Sugata, that he is the teacher, from the fact that he's the teacher, that he desires to help all sentient beings, or Buddha's desire to help all sentient beings. So that is set forth, and then in order to establish that compassion, which is that special property of the Buddha, the perfection of the great compassion, which is, in the case of a Buddha, the desire to benefit all of the migrating beings in the world. In order to establish that, you first have to establish that there are past and future lives, because without past and future lives, there's no way that this compassion could have been developed to that perfect degree in which it's completely non-discriminatory and expanded to encompass all of the beings within the universe. And then in order to establish then that great compassion is, so first of all, then there were the proofs that were laid out to establish past and future lives. And it must be said that we went over those in a very sort of, just as kind of an overview and hitting some of the main points, not in all of the detail that it's presented in the text here. Then, so we got to the great compassion, and so the summation of that is given on page 312, where it says, compassion, wisdom, etc. have a stable basis because they arise from accustomation. One can translate that again as conditioning or habituation of their own previous homogenes. That's instances of compassion that are of the same type, based on the clear cognition of the mind. They are not dependent from moment to moment on a new, different effort, because when they arise, when they are accustomated, or you've conditioned your mind to them, they will naturally enter the mind. Or this word naturally, as Roger's translated, it also could be translated sort of as automatically. It occurs without effortlessly, automatically engage or operate within the mind, just as fire, etc., naturally enters wood until the wood is reduced to ashes and well refined, and so forth.
Oh yeah, that tell us about you say, Gala. And it's so Zavala, so we set up Zavada Shadow Tana, Kombala, Komba Kondo Pegina. Any Chombatia, any Kombala, any castle, or Komba Kondo to Tammy the Peggy Vess. Kombala, or Kombala Jesso, Kombala Pewata, Chonu with the Kombala Pewa Chibare, Bayinda, and Chombaya Tammy the Peggy, Kombala Pewa, Peggy Cheris, Della, Jesso, any castle. Kombale, Rindangama, Koma Kona, Kondo, Pewa, Tenteter, Chomba Rindangama, Chomba Chima Chuma Mares. Rindangama. Carriers and a Chomba Chima to Ranguli, top down, Beso, Chitam Yoba, Tesamle, and Chumari Mato, Chomba Kona, Kondo, but the Ranguli, down. Any Chomba Beso, Chitam Yoba, Tesamle, Chumba Res, Rindangama, Chumba Mares. Then a Chomba the Chang with Danja Res. The Chomba the Chang with Danja in the Ranguli, go down, the Chong you, Ligi down, Beso de Changavares. Or Ligi down, Beso Telki, Chomba de Chashan to Jigres, Ligi down, Beso Kanto Yoba Tea, Tetan, Chomba, and a Chomba Tang, and a Teta the Gibi, Nuanga Nishes. Maramato, Tamido de Maris, yeah.
So now this is on page 314 in the middle. Then someone might raise the objection that it would follow that jumping ability, etc., also can be increased infinitely because they increase from accustomation. Now, so we've said the argument here is that compassion can be increased limitlessly without any limit, because through this habituation or conditioning of the mind to them. And so then the opponent comes back and says, well, if that's the case, then the same thing would apply to the ability to jump, because they can be developed through this conditioning or accustomation. The reply to that is, it follows that it is not the case that later jumps, that is, some jump in the future, can originate from previous homogeneous jumps, as compassion, etc., originate from compassion, because however great one's physical strength and exertion, only that great will the jump be. Therefore, a jump has a nature such that its extent is limited, because the causes physical strength and exertion have the limited ability to generate only a measured jump. So the basic argument here is that the cause, which is really giving rise to the jump, is the ability, the body's strength, and the strength and the ability of the body to exert itself. Those have sort of ultimate limits, whereas that's not the case with the way in which the mind can be developed and expanded through the habituation to things like compassion and wisdom and so forth.
Oh yeah, ini ligi dom nar sombagi, rawa chomba chizam jangna, ani kondo pewaji misuba juna, anten misuba jula, tetana, ani te kondo pewade, ani ngusumdu chuba yinza ngusumda gagre sena. Oh. 가서래 아니 대대 거야 되라 당보 총바 종이 타마와테 총자야게 아니 정달 챙겨게 타마와테 당보네 치총위 차신도 총바 말했어 당보네 치총위 치 양다른 가서 총구에나야 당보네 치총위 차신도 총바 말했어 튀제 찬양 아니 야 가르잖아 특히 튀제 찬양 가게나 맞아봐 가게 파견서지 리 양와다 믿음 받쳐와 예장 아니 양와 차베 차렸어作为人民믿음 바 파견라 소와 파사네针对现在那个创完了파도 지바게 파견라 소베 내대다 아니 사네 장나양 타메도 페그 말했어 타메도 메베데 대단한 랑길이 가르서는 총바지나 랑길이 또 시선이야 봐 대다도 아니 총두고래 마도 온템 편제도 총문이 와대 아니 체내비실 와 총바 링자라 잖아 총비 링장 아마 공부를 깨와듯이 이나 총바 링자라 깨와이나 아니 감바 디바잠지 아니 기링부 총바 타와 당 공바잠 탐에도 공바잠 탐에도 법이나 아니 다 대중가 차준다 두 공배냠나 총마냐바 타와고 어디서 말해.
So then the opponent then would come back and say, or could come back and say, well then, no matter how much jumping is practiced, it is impossible that steadily applied physical strength can increase that ability any more. If you assert that, then you contradict perception, or something which is obvious. The opponent is arguing or making the claim there. The reply to that is that when that ordinary being first practices jumping, they do not, from that first jump, jump as far as they later will be able to jump, because even if the appropriate conditions are fulfilled, that is the effort and the effort of the body, physical weakness and imbalance are induced by an excess of phlegm, etc. That's referring to basically elements in the body that make it heavy and prevent it from sort of a lightness that would enable it to jump in a sort of unlimited fashion. One clears away the phlegm and the other imbalances through gradual effort, but even when one is purified of them, one will not be able to increase one's jumping ability infinitely, because even then one's jumping ability remains limited by the extent of one's own physical strength. So here the argument is that even if you eliminate some of the things that limit your ability to jump in the beginning and thereby increase the distance of your jump to a certain degree, there are ultimate limits to physical strength within the body, and those that final limit of the body's strength makes a ultimate limit for one's ability to jump. And it continues, the commentary continues there. If jumping ability arises from previous homogenes, that means from things of the same type, that means previous jumps, then it follows that merely by lifting one's foot to jump, one will jump a long way. So what that means is that if your previous steps or jumps that you had taken were sort of carried over into the present, the power of those was accumulated, then a single jump, the subsequent jump would enable you to propel yourself a long distance. And then the final argument is that it also follows that if mere practice is the cause of infinite increase, then birds and monkeys should also have equal jumping ability since they are equally practiced.
Oh yeah, that is the one you are telling. You leading that people, the one teller. And it also the work in the Yana. And it's some yet time in the chamber you go to rest. Some yet time in the chamber you are rest. The water, Thomas Magic, the water, Thomas Magic, ranking the James. Oh, Thomas Magic, ranking the Java in the some yet time in you. That teller, you make it and Jadella. Ranking the Sabella to be the one you chamber the churches. Oh, ranking the Sabella to be the one you chamber chance, Tom be similar. Ranking you but tea, done you do 2 days. Oh, that's what the corner paid. And it's the one corner paid the tumble, the what short was the one. Then it's some yet maybe the one you chamber jetty. Then the one you chamber tiggy, tambi, chajuk some gate. Chaju is some combat latana, and it castle tolam, jolam. Then I told them to go away. Oh, you do what you should put some tolam with similar ranking Uncle Juba tea down you do 2 days. Tolam but the combat heavy in the classics. Tolam but tea, combat heavy. He gula around the Rindi, Sabi, Gujan, and the castle. Rangi Rindi, Nija Corner, Condo, Pewachebi, Sabenji, Debu, Gujansen, and Debu. And the castle, Midiji Shedan, so you never me amaris. Midiji Shedan could never maybe say, Semjan Gula, and he never told you amaris. That's all my joke, or maybe she dance. Semjan Gula, and it's about English and Boyabatavi, or Marete, Semjan Gashiki Gula Jang. 你这这样，安尼两写当说句，安尼你这做嘛有啊？你这就yeah.
So now then the opponent here comes back and says, well, it follows, according to your position, this is on page 316 of the translation, skipping over the verses that present the material that's discussed in the translation, in the commentary. So on page 316 of the translation, and it's middle of 209 on the Tibetan text. So the opponent here would come back and say, well, according to your reasoning, it would follow that all sentient beings have great compassion because compassion is beginningless and arises from its own homogenes, meaning that everyone has had compassion to some sentient beings in the past, and so those instances of compassion would then serve as bases for this compassion to be developed to the state of great compassion, even among ordinary sentient beings. But the reply to that is there is no such flaw in our position. Compassion and great compassion, which originate from their own homogeneous seeds, meaning events of compassion in the past, where a person has developed compassion, and that mind state functions then as a seed for the arising of a homogeneous mind state in the future. So that kind of these compassion and great compassion, which originate from their own homogeneous seeds, have a nature such that they naturally enter into the mind of a bodhisattva on the path of seeing, because compassion developed by a bodhisattva when they are on the path of seeing possesses a cause that is its own homogeneous seed in their mind stream, a seed that is not damaged by such opposing factors as anger, etc. So what this is referring to here is that a bodhisattva at the very beginning of the path, when they are on the path of accumulation, they first have to develop compassion and great compassion using a great deal of effort. And it's the cultivation or accustomation of the mind to compassion and great compassion occur through meditative conditioning of the mind to that. And so when they do that, then over time they get stronger and stronger, and they develop that through the path of accumulation, path of application or preparation. And then finally, when they reach the path of seeing, that compassion and the great compassion has become so powerful that, and in particular, by the achievement of the path of seeing, they eliminate anger from their minds, such that anger no longer arises and it will no longer destroy great compassion that they've produced within their mind stream. So in the case of ordinary beings, because of they develop, and this will come later, the explanation of this, ordinary beings, because they get angry, they essentially damage or destroy the potency of these seeds that they've implanted in their mind streams previously through developing compassion, even in a limited fashion.
Oh yeah, that is it. Also, and it's some power. And the ranking yellow so what I mean. Some short of some power ranking yellow so what I mean. And it do other Tananya be what and it's what some remember, you get some remark, you just some maris. Or dig carriers and you just some maris. Some regular, some shangula me buggy, you just Jimma maris. Or some regular, some shangula, tell them, there was some Jimma, Missy Days, some regular. Toma Mabana Rangi, a Patama, or Macheba, or Casam Chemanu, watch Missiba Yinza, Tetan Tea, never Jawa Tetan Tea, never so, tell me Besawaji, injury Java Yeva Yinza, some regular, some Jan, Gula, or Tetan Manuma Maris, in the Chora, what's the Gemanuma Maris, some regular Toma Mabata Ranga Patama, Chemanuma, Meba Yinza, or Missiba Yinza, Gemanu and Missiba.
So then here, like now, in terms of what is compassion as opposed to great compassion, when we take, the commentary continues here and says, taking as one's intentional object, or just the object that one has focused one's mind upon, one's relatives who are born as ordinary sentient beings, and thinking if only they could be free from suffering, is mere compassion. It is not great compassion. So that's the kind of instances or mental events of compassion that ordinary people, ordinary sentient beings have towards their relatives and friends and so forth. That's mere compassion, but not great compassion. And then the commentary continues. It says, it is impossible that each sentient being not experience in their mind stream compassion, etc., toward all other sentient beings, because it is impossible that there be a sentient being who has not experienced each other sentient being as their father, mother, their parents, and so forth, at some point in the beginninglessness of time. If compassion, etc., were not destroyed by anger and so forth, it is impossible that there be a sentient being who will not at some point take all sentient beings as their intentional object or focal object and generate the great compassion that that desires to free all sentient beings from suffering. However, if compassion towards one sentient being arises, that disappears when it is destroyed by anger. So the point of this, it's presented in a negative fashion, but it's saying here that it is the case that because of the beginninglessness of samsara, we've had compassion towards all sentient beings individually on limitless, numberless occasions, because there have been numberless occasions when each sentient being was our mother, father, and so forth, and we felt compassion towards their suffering. But in the intervening time periods, because of instances of anger that have arisen in our mind streams, even towards those individual sentient beings or other sentient beings, those instances of anger have damaged or negated the power of the moments of compassion that we felt in the past towards all sentient beings, and thus it's not possible for ordinary sentient beings to cultivate the great compassion that, for example, a bodhisattva who's achieved the path of seeing is able to achieve, because of the way in which anger has served as an counter agent against the moments, the instances of compassion that sentient beings have experienced.
Oh yeah, that's it. Sometimes really can rang pada mam, chemanyuwa yinzam, manyuwa jemezan tedala. 今年个说，你这我买几把药买的，听着你这我买几把的，你写当个买什么？体育都什么了？明年东亚的团队机，你就全部没被什么没事了，写当个买什么呢？你什么久了没被这，什么久了没被这我怎么这样？你听着你这我的写当个专门两百千万银子，两百千万的，哦。
So therefore, again, to repeat that we've experienced. I mean, it is true that sentient beings, ordinary sentient beings, have experienced compassion towards all other individual sentient beings. So collectively, or ordinary beings, have experienced compassion towards all sentient beings. But those individual instances of compassion towards individual sentient beings have been damaged, or basically destroyed. Their power has been destroyed by the intervening instances of anger that we felt towards other sentient beings in the intervening time period. So at the present, for example, a sentient being ordinary sentient beings are not able to take all other sentient beings as their focal object. They're not able to focus their minds on the collective totality of all sentient beings and produce great compassion towards them in some effortless way, because they've had those instances of anger towards all of those sentient beings in the intervening time period.
Oh yeah, 这里听见恐怕的马战呢，恐怕的马战呢，他们都拍完的了，是吧？那么空心白做节目了嘛，所以才那么恐怕的马战呢，他们都拍完的，甚至去在我当，那种把查查了下巴，查查机落了说话。 查查记落了说话太大，去身边有他们家了，要把他有捐卖的时候，什么叫他们家了，要把他有捐卖的，让给我正在这样，让给我也正在这样，恐怕俺们当这样，俺们七八度3万7万3万人了，恐怕黄年高度他们都拍完7万给，原来做这点的是，人家来这样啊。 这我怎么就没这把？去恐怕俺们太阳，俺们来7、3万这边3万人了。我听着我的身边科技了，没被写了，是哦。那你叫我你点你空，叫我你当这边点把空是别说节目了，没得把它用点把它做，等这个叫我你恐怕7万了，就把让给俺给就比这位大你都觉得，这准备就来查查当。 查见了，查把矿呢，矿都拍完它，没都把光被落了，没都把光把了，啥西他们家，告诉给这个查完了，说话，一落俺个就往哪些人是，
So then the explanation then continues there that thus, and this is on page 317 of the translation at bottom of 209 in the Tibetan. Thus, the consequential flaw that there would exist in all sentient beings, those other subsequent minds that are the mental events or dharmas of compassion and detachment, etc., is not present, because compassion and detachments natures arise from homogenes or events of the similar type, but the root of the generation of increasing excellence in their clarification is previous accustomation or habituation conditioning. And this conditioning or habituation, even previous to that, and such accustomation is not present in every sentient being. So the sentient beings, they don't spontaneously have compassion and detachment and so forth, even though they have in some previous existences developed those to some degree, where they've had moments of compassion, moments of detachment, etc. But they haven't cultivated those, developed those over time, and in order to increase them to the sort of superlative degree of excellence in their clarity or their, and so therefore they don't have those. And then examples are given for how this works. And for example, by possession of the two applications, one will have that here. Two applications is shorthand for sort of intense, continuous and intense application of oneself to some kind of topic. One will have a compassionate nature that naturally or automatically enters into the mind stream through accustomation, because we see likewise that in an arhat's mind stream, detachment arises naturally, and that in the mind streams of those who are attached, there naturally or almost automatically arises attachment, and in the mind stream of a yogi or yogini meditating on the unpleasant, there naturally arises aversion. So the third example here is like someone who has developed meditative concentration, which focuses on the disgusting nature of things in the world, is able to see the world as sort of like a world of skeletons, sentient beings as like skeletons, and meditate on the unpleasant nature. And so even when they're not actually, if they've conditioned or accustomated their minds to that sufficiently through that meditative practice, then they're able to, these things, the perception of these things as being unpleasant arises automatically without any kind of effort on their part. So these are examples for how compassion can be developed.
Oh yeah, that 누나 가서래 토마 이제 전부 제비죠. 맛이 진짜听说了说嘛光呢. 아니 당부 아니作为什么样的参加了面呢 아니 어떻게 맛이 진짜听说是光把了되네. 아니 이 용이 남바자도 차라 용 참바 좀네. 되네. 아니 가서了什么样参加了面呢 동화다 장도지 이제 숙제지见呢. 是吧 숙제지见呢. 아니 되네 양做全部接吧那做我人讲 人家人家토마见的是吧 人家토마做我全部接吧那做我人家人家人家토마见的그래 天这人家太大的人家토마狂把来太大狂把钱呗 아니人呗 아니做完了没对吧 做没几年我推呢 아니 발전한 마대왕왕 휴식이 아니 섬년 남미 동화다 찬도 그자와도 깨그래서 라 시시다를 좋아라 뭐도 봐 인지 침봉을 랑경한 거 집에 다니도 좋아 인지 당보는 좋아라 마도 봐네 마이노 당보 좋아라 되네 아니 관배 왕기 아니 타를 아니 랑경한 거 좋아 좀매기 영화 텐데 가라 아니 랑경한 거 좋아 좀 그래서
So now then the summation of this is the top of 318 in the translation. So at first, taking all sentient beings as one's intentional object, visualizing all sentient beings or focusing your mind upon all sentient beings, one generates through effort a forceful compassion that desires to free them from suffering, desires them to be free from suffering. So this is referring to at the beginning. There's even a preceding stage to this is developing an attitude towards sentient beings that all sentient beings are attractive or objects of affection. That one has affection towards all sentient beings, like one has affection towards one's mother and close friends and so forth. So having that affectionate attitude towards all sentient beings, then that serves as a basis for developing compassion from seeing them as suffering in their various forms of suffering. So through that effort, one necessarily has to take a great deal of effort in the beginning to produce this powerful compassion that is the wish to free them from suffering. When one has generated that compassion with great effort, if each of those efforts is able to generate many homogenes of compassion, that is, each of the efforts, when you have a powerful effort, it's able to produce multiple forms of that, basically mind states or events of that compassion. And so that kind of production of those instances of compassion in the mind stream through such habituation or accustomation, one comes to have a nature such that great compassion naturally, or again I would translate this maybe even as automatically, spontaneously enters into the mind stream or arises within one's mental stream without depending on that effort. But such accustomation or conditioning is not independent of effort from the very beginning. So that's a key point, that in the beginning one necessarily has to apply a great deal of effort at developing this through habituation, conditioning. It eventually develops such that this compassion arises great compassion arises spontaneously without the need of effort.
Oh yeah, that dela tambo le tola mi de ba mai no se. Da chong ba ni ani liu khao khosa xian du zhe bi ani liu khosa ga so ro ni sa khu xian du zhe khosa xian du zhe bi ge ji re re la yang ani bai so re go gu re se. Ge ji re re ran bai so re go gu re ma de zo kang du bai so le na ani liu sa la ma ju re se. But then sort of the counterexample that the sort of claim that the opponent here is making, that compassion is similar to something like some physical feat like jumping, doesn't apply, because jumping is, on the other hand, requires effort on every occasion, on each moment that one is attempting to do it. So jumping requires the assistance effort as a complementary factor for each moment that the body is moving away from the ground. And whenever that effort slackens, the body will fall to the ground. So basically it's saying that each time one attempts to jump, you have to apply effort on that occasion. And every instance, there's never a point where one is able to jump without any kind of effort at all and spontaneously. Oh yeah, that didn't matter. That is my shepherd is so hungry. So, I need Castan and Dumashin, which a ton of land and one your Tawaki. Then it up to then Jesseni Seni Tambotella. I need to then Dumashin be serious and that. Oh, the dance, the one you shimmer the Debasson Jalaba. And the Toma, and the Dunga Shiva get Tamnam, Musum to Tommy Cheto, and the Combatagoresta, Dunga Shivi Tamnam, Sega Dunga Shiva get Tam, and it is Coachito Geribasame. Or Coachito Geribata, and a Combachano Gomgoide. Oh, Tomarani, Dunga Shivi Tamna, Chawadija Dunga, never Shiva get Tam. 아니요 관주비를 받아 도비를 빌람데다 아나 가서는 무슨 또 통비 치도 대신 아니 저번이 된 저 컴바자 고그래 제가 그거한테 가르를 했으나 삼전지 동화 시험바 시비 소식 임비체를 와 삼전지 동화 시험바 제발라 나라라니 안에 동안이와 시비 시토고 바시고 고기와 인자 랑그 텐도 텐데서 매람 투야 마음에나 현지 텐도 갈라지 소와인자 라 동아지 나수 삼바나 파부요고 잠 매바 삼전前동아라 다되지 이제 제사 매배 소와나시 전에 송바 예장 옹내라 아니더라니 동아 시비 타라 아노 빼고 그래 어디 인자 삼전 탐제지 동아 시험바 시비 소식이 미체를 차와 여대 탑레 추위 동아당 고배 덴바스 와 탑레 추마 동아 아니 다 원도비를 비완 주비를 비완도 채나 아 가서 동아 대부창 아니 뒤주 동아당 고대니 보대 동아대 관주비 대부탕 고대대 관도비 대부 두디 군주인데 관주비 군주다 남대대 관 아니 가도비가 아니 주체니 저 우리장 가서래 담보 동아지랑신도 마시나 풍부대 동아지랑신도 마시나 아니 동아지랑신도 메시나 풍부 동아당 차와라 이중께 메시 대위나 동아지 길을 본데 미제바 인장 동아 담보시 동아 담보시 동아당 차위 차와 되라 안에 가서 동아당 차위 차와 여바다 마도나 안에 동아당 차와를 제발기 가서래 담보대 동아당 차위 차와 여바 제고 와다 담보체 안에 과대세 곧 디제라도 아니 동아당 차위 과바 토바 제발라 토제지 남공고바 인장 양과 인장我他们来穷啊是有观众来带呢这个动画堂有他们来带呢这个搞不去你穷啊인장是的他就提出过去吧提前把你搞完人现在说我对他们要把过度去完人啊你是过度去完人啊七级马老把小娃搞完人不是
So that then demonstration that compassion is, and great compassion in particular, are can be developed, leads into the next topic, which is showing the way in which the excellence of application arises from the excellence of the intention. So, in summary here, this next section shows how the Buddha is as teacher, and then as Sugata, and then as Savior. Those three final epithets of the set of five that are the basic framework for this exposition of the text. And so this is there's a verse here which is the brief demonstration of this, and it's on the middle of 318 in the translation, and it says, a compassionate one directly affects the application of methods to destroy suffering. Methodical occurrences and their causes are hidden phenomena. They are difficult to explain. And then the commentary here at the bottom of 318 going into 319 is as follows. It is reasonable that a compassionate one, a bodhisattva on the path of application, initially directly affects accustomation via the two applications in order to see through perception, by perception, the methods for pacifying their own suffering, because they are an ordinary being who desires to destroy the sufferings of all sentient beings. So to unpack this, it says that, it's referring here to a bodhisattva who's on the very beginning of the path of application, where they've developed great compassion, which is sort of the door, entranceway to the path the path of accumulation. But here it's referring to the bodhisattva on the path of application, or the path of preparation is another way to translate this. So initially, such a bodhisattva has to affect their own conditioning or accustomation to the methods for pacifying their own suffering, because they are an ordinary being who ultimately desires to destroy the sufferings of all sentient beings. So at the very beginning of the path, that's why these Four Noble Truths are taught in the order in which they are. Even as far as the way a bodhisattva needs to realize all of this in its entirety, they first have to take as their object suffering, and their own suffering. That is, one has to recognize that one's own aggregates are of the nature of this pervasive condition of being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction, that fundamental basic nature of samsara. The aggregates are of this condition of being created by contaminated karma and mental affliction. Taking that as themselves as the object, then they're able to apply that to other sentient beings and see how other sentient beings are, no matter what sort of status they have that fundamental nature of samsara with respect to them as well. Without that kind of recognition, there's no way to develop great compassion, the wish to free all sentient beings from samsara, because one doesn't know what samsara is. So in order to understand samsara properly, one necessarily has to understand the causes of samsara, that the origin of samsara is the mental afflictions and karma that are the causes that produce it. And then in order to develop the wish to become free from samsara, even for oneself, much less speaking about all other sentient beings, one necessarily has to understand that there is a state of being separated from samsara. Separation from samsara is another name for cessation or nirvana, this state of isolation or separation from the samsaric condition. In order to understand that, one necessarily has to understand that the cessation of samsara, the state of being separated or free from samsara, actually exists. One has to also understand the source that could give rise to that state of freedom from samsara, which is the methods which are laid out in the path, the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. So the end of this this section of the explanation says that it follows that the reason pervades because of the truths of suffering and cessation, which are methodical occurrences. That's a technical term here, meaning something which is the basis for the arising of occurrence of something else. So in the case of the truth of suffering, the so-called methodical occurrence or basis for the arising of that is the origin of suffering. In the case of the cessation of suffering, the so-called methodical occurrence or basis for that occurring is the path. And the methodical occurrences and the truths of origination and path, which are their causes, are hidden phenomena, and they will be difficult to explain or cognize in an undistorted fashion. So this last part saying is that all of these things are so-called hidden phenomena, meaning they're not obvious, something that's perceptible through the senses. Rather, they need to be established through inference. Hidden phenomena or somewhat obscure phenomena are things that can only be established. We can only gain valid cognition of them through inference rather than perception. They're difficult to explain, that is, and they're also difficult to, one cannot understand them in an undistorted fashion without applying oneself to gaining an inferential understanding of how they exist.
Oh yeah, that teacher la, she was going to say, teacher been the go in. That chance to join them, boss, and that he should nothing.我强生说起咱们的了，错起咱们的叫咱们这些送过来的， 초지롬 세가라 조디 초람세데 아니 다음에 비테 아니 퇴섬이 때라 바바 갑자라 아니 초지 초람 치용원도 치용원도다 초나 지바인바데 치용원도 세데 아니 대신메다 저주로만 다음에 비테 퇴섬지 조르 때라 바바 갑인장 치용원도 세와름 다더니 조람라 퇴원도 세야래 어디 건지 퇴원 봐도 봐셔와니 아니 검중 做公众的关呢，公众的路有关呢，我带了别把延长，俺的台湾都是真的是公众的送过来的，延长。俺那前就给什么建议，他们做特什么就带了跑，等下打没了，没不公众团队干了，俺那前什么就叫他们透过我的，其他顺着倒把了。我们呢，天着我的前身叫他们把是个的，天着为前身叫他们把的，但我都是个日本主把是日本主过的是。是吧？日本看着中国人是呢，没咋说居住，他的习惯那些，这些没咋说居住啊，大没把啦。大没把多把抬了，三那推马的你是对我的是，大没被推了三那推马的，那是，三那推马的你是对了是，那你囤积了三那推马那样，这是那大没囤积出去都被落在了三那推马抬了样，那特别出现什么个事，你谁马上你说来哇，我都记住过来是吧？咱们个天气啥的，搞的山上生个的，公众个山上了找个的马多，你既然咱们了山上吞把，咱们错了搞水个话的，是吧？咱们了山上吞把错了搞水个话，真的山上的公众个山上脱把了钱呢，到这搞咱们了公众个山上脱把得了。아니 세계 섬지기 선바다 마서머니 요카리와 사나 년도의 그 내가서 다음 처럼 그 내가서 집바체 대시 청원도 어떻게 때라 봐봐 년도의 그 처럼 아니 대시 메다서 년도의 그 처럼 내가서 아니 다 가서래 검증기 산나 텀바고 와 집바인 바래 이장 디 가서래 검증기 산나라 자 마도 산나다 많이 바 산나 텀바담 처럼래 요바체 다 텐지라 검증 다음에 텐지 수지 또 빌로텔라 검증기 산나 토바텔라 장주기 섬지 섬바다 마제바 니수 내와데我都是个日本主部的，这主把现在三九审批大美囤积了三两的蛋白，公众个三两的蛋白，七八对七位卡萨得了，七八对七八卡萨得了，俺产生叫那么是个的，
So now then, next comes an explanation of a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva on the path of application, or this is the way the translation gives it, path of application. I sometimes translate this as path of preparation. So the commentary here says that the existence of a bodhisattva on the path of application is proved by objectively impelled reasoning. The cognition of impermanence and the other 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, by way of their generic images, I usually use the term concept in place of generic image. In my translations, Roger's using the terminology of generic image, but I use something like concept, is divided into two clear and unclear appearances of the concept or generic image. The clear appearance of the generic image or concept are proved by objectively impelled reasoning to be two: those held by the generation of the Mahayana thought of enlightenment, bodhicitta, and those which are not held by the generation of the Mahayana thought of bodhicitta. A person who is distinguished by possessing a clear appearance of a generic image of no self, selflessness, through being held by the generation of the Mahayana thought, bodhicitta, is called a bodhisattva on the path of application. Now, to explain this in some detail. So a bodhisattva has achieved this path of preparation or application. We can establish such a person through reasoning, which operates through the force of objective facts. This special term of, I think he's translating it here as objectively impelled reasoning, or reasoning which it operates through the force of factual things. So let's see, where am I? So in general, we can say we have to distinguish between, so a bodhisattva who's on the path of accumulation, or someone who is developing the arhat path. Someone who's developing the path to becoming an arhat, who's following the lesser vehicle, they, on the path of their accumulation, develop a clear conceptual understanding of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths and the kind of selflessness which is explained within that context. And they do that through study, through hearing the teachings and contemplation of the teachings, or critical analysis of the teachings, or reflections on the teachings. And then at the end, sort of the end of that path of accumulation, they develop a clear concept, this kind of clear or generic image of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, as well as the selflessness that's embedded within that. And so they develop that through the force of their engagement in study and analysis, contemplation of the subject matter. Then when they shift over to the path of application, or we call it the path of preparation, they, through the process of meditative conditioning or habituation, they develop eventually, at the culmination of that path, a concept or generic image of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths and the kind of selflessness which is contained within that exposition of the path, through the force of meditative conditioning. And so at the culmination of that path of application or path of preparation, they achieve that sort of state of clear realization of the subject matter through the force of meditative conditioning, and have that clear concept of it, which serves as the basis for shifting into the path of seeing in the next subsequent path. As far as the bodhisattva is concerned, they, on the path of accumulation, follow the same procedure, except they're developing an awareness of selflessness, the selflessness of persons as well as all other phenomena, and as it's explained in the Mahayana tradition. And then they practice hearing and study and analytical reflection, analysis of the subject, and they in turn develop that clear concept which arises from hearing the subject and meditative concentration. When they achieve the culmination of that process, they have that. Then taking that clear conceptual understanding that they have through that process, they shift into the path of preparation or application, and by developing meditative cultivation or conditioning in that way, they in turn develop their clear conceptual understanding, or conceptual image, you could say, of the selflessness that's the primary object of the meditative concentration during that, and then they achieve that during that process. So the distinguishing factor here, what is it that distinguishes the bodhisattva from the person who's following the lesser vehicle path, is whether or not their meditative practice is held or governed by bodhicitta. In the case of the person following the lesser vehicle path, they don't have bodhicitta, so there's no they're not following the Mahayana path. Whereas the Bodhisattva, because their practice of listening, hearing the teachings, conceptual analysis, and the clear conceptual understanding that they develop through that on the path of application or preparation, because that is governed by bodhicitta, that makes them a follower of the Mahayana path. And the same thing applies then in the case of the bodhisattva who has achieved the path of application or path of preparation. The conceptual knowledge or image that they have of selflessness is, as it were, held by or governed by their bodhicitta, and that's the key distinguishing factor there.
Oh yeah, that thing is what then they say. That Java Shaba Della, Banja Tobi Tota, Nimbo the Tobi Su, Tabu Gova. That day in the Gana Banja Tobi Tab Della, Anita Karsore, Nunda River Namja, but Dunga Niji Chabachi, Dunga Judan Temper, the last one Shin Toba there, said it in Brimbury. What did he Kasar Da, the Shinelu Chip Tamaba Maris, the Bungus, the Shinelu Chabam, the Shinelu Toba Chabak Tamaba Maris. That when you carry a sonata, touching Hond Shua Nashin Shani, Toma Lula Dambas, Tujung Sheram, so Surabjit, Toy Dole, and it is Shinelu Chip, Tujung Sheram. Then I saw sort of the Sabbath Shumi, and or Tala Deshinelu Tambaki, a sort of the Sabbath Shumi, and a share of key, repair, and a number chopper. Deshinelu Chopper, Chopper Yinzang, and Chapala Tana Deshinelu Tobachi Yongo Yuainzang, Deshinelu Toba Tamaba Mayende, Tana Luna Tembi, Tana Sabi Share, Repair number Chopper in Bichel, said, what do Lula repair number Para? So Yana Shaji Nesums, Tongu, Chusa Goju, Shidu Goju, Shajan Nesura, or Shajan Sum. Top social na gonna Java Chades, Ra Top social now. Top social career, Sajang Usum Bani, Usum the Jaya. And it Shaja Castle, Chusa Gojuni, Modo Jiribala Dana Toya. Shaja Shidu Gojuni, and a Lula Dana Matoba, and it Modo Riba Tomotoba Yinza. Yana Shajin, some top social gonna Java Chade, Shidu go to Jason Tabi Lundang. Nani la lungi nidula midamba riba number chapas lungu to the masonwa. Ani ota riba number chapai, riba number chapachai, only to riba number chapa. Yeah.
So now then, this leads into an more extensive explanation of that, which is subdivided at the top. This is the top of page 320 in the English translation, and top of page 211 in the Tibetan text. So this is subdivided into two. The extensive explanation is divided into two parts: the method of cognizing what is to be abandoned, and the way of cognizing the antidote, and then the purpose of this analysis. The verses here that explain that in the basic text in the Pramanavarttika are through scripture and reasoning one investigates the aspects of the truths. One affects cognition of the cause of suffering and the nature of that suffering as being impermanent, etc. Because if therefore the cause of suffering abide, one will not see how to counteract the result. One will understand suffering itself by its characteristics. So this is the root text. And the commentary here explains that it is not the case that there is no method for investigating the actuality, or one can translate this term also as reality. It's just another of the many terms for reality, or the way things are, etc., of the Four Noble Truths, because cognizing them initially through the wisdom of study, which is based on scripture, and then through reasoning, that is the wisdom of reflection, one investigates the aspects of the truths. So this is referring to, at the very beginning of the entire path, one necessarily has to engage in the process of hearing the teachings, studying the teachings by hearing them, and then and it's only and then one learns the Four Noble Truths in that manner, and then through thinking about them and critically analyzing them through the wisdom of analysis. And then one develops the wisdom that arises from reflection, and it's through that one initially has to investigate all of the aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Then it says, alternatively, one must investigate in terms of the methods applied to the three types of authority objects. You could translate this authority objects term here as the objects of the three types of avenues of valid cognition, which are perception, inference, and scripture. Because one investigates very hidden phenomena by scripture that is itself ascertained to be pure by the three tests, or it's undergone three forms of analysis, and manifest or obvious and hidden phenomena, slightly hidden phenomena, by reasoning that does not depend on scripture for its refutation or proof. So this is referencing again, which we mentioned earlier, the three types of objects of knowledge, things which can be known through an avenue of valid cognition. There are objects which are called, obvious or obvious objects, which can be known through perception. So things that we can see, for example, we know these through valid cognition through our perceptual faculty of vision, and we know those things authoritatively or validly through a sense perception which is not damaged or impaired by any kind of thing that would affect it. Then slightly hidden objects are things which we can't know through our senses, but can only understand conceptually through inference. So in order to know those through a means of valid cognition, avenue of valid cognition, which in this case is inference, we have to rely upon reasoning, which is based on evidence. So in the case of objects which can be ascertained to be the case in this fashion, the ultimate ground of any kind of reasoning is the way in which things operate in a factual way. So inference that operates through the force of things, the way things are, is the final criterion for the inference as an avenue of valid cognition. Then finally, scripture is an avenue of valid cognition with respect to things which are said are extremely obscure or extremely hidden. You can't know, there are certain objects, things which we can't know through our senses. We can't establish them through inference, which is based on things which are knowable through inference and perception. Rather, we have to take them, gain knowledge of them through scripture, and then scripture itself has to be investigated and established as being an avenue of valid cognition through analysis, which investigates whether it's internally coherent, whether it's contradicted by perception or by inference, and so these criteria which establish whether or not scripture is an avenue of valid cognition.
Oh yeah, that didn't take us 자서 전화 받았다. 아니 다 토마 랑게 사전에 연이 원거 중에 사전에 연이 풍부대 아니 동안공 콘도 추고와 연장. 콘도 추바대 동안 얘기 쳐봐지 콘도 추바. 사전에 연이 풍부대다 동안 영어 랑공 이 콘도 쳐봐 동안지라서 콘도 쳐봐나 나 동안 매대나 동안 도고래 동안데 도고래 안 동아 도와 쳐발라 동아 주마도나 동아 믿어봐 예배 아니 동아 될 주예매장 주태양 안 따바다 메다다 메다발라서 그 주이랑실라 따바제 야 따바제고 그래서 따바제고 준전에 가르래 사나 동아 아니 믿어봐입니다 동아 뽕대봐마 동아 셴봐 동아 봉되는 베더밤 아니 동아 봉거나 아니 동아지 주방우래 인자 동아지 주예담 동아 주매담 동아를 주매밤 아니 동아지 주 따버내나 아니 동아 도배 탐매봐 인자 아니 제우 동아 가서래 따버내나 제우 동아 그 녀부도지 아니 동아 그 녀부 동아 제지 그 녀부 고배 또지 제우 동아 로바티와 말이 누구 말이 스텔로스 바 메시로
So then, therefore, when was this is the top of page 321? When one has understood the nature of suffering, it is reasonable that one affect cognition. That means one should gain a knowledge, gain an understanding of whether there is or is not a cause of that suffering, etc. So here, at the beginning, once you understood what suffering is, the actual nature of it, reality of it, then it's necessary that one should, reasonable that one should gain an understanding of whether there is or is not a cause of that, and whether the nature of that cause is permanent or impermanent. Because if therefore suffering is causeless or the cause abides permanently, then someone who desires to destroy suffering will not see how to counteract the suffering result through the power of the antidote. So the basic point here is that once one has ascertained the nature of suffering, its real nature, obviously one should gain an understanding of whether or not there is a way to eliminate that suffering, an antidote to it. If the cause of suffering was and the basic approach to analyzing that is whether or not the origin of suffering, the cause of suffering, is permanent or impermanent. If the cause of suffering is permanent, then there'd be no way to eliminate it, and suffering itself would be something that one could not gain freedom from.
Oh yeah, 아니 동아 규제 동아 규다 자와탕 동아디 아니 가서래 연예 용 사전연이 풍부되라잖아 규련이라 왕 총왕의 규제탕 아니 규제양 미다바인바 미다지 연예 시왕 전인바 동안 대이양 안에 랑가 자와탕 是吧？아니 가서래 캐리 쳐봐서는 동아의 아니 님뭐 맞대나 동아 관에 관도 태와탕 年不大呢，俺那配置切吧，配置切比切吧机，俺那打卡是东阿给，年龄一碰不的东阿这让许多矿都出过来。
So then, once one when one analyzes it in that way, one is able to understand that suffering has a cause, and that cause itself is impermanent, because suffering itself is understood by its visible characteristics. We can observe in suffering, obviously, through seeing how it operates, and we can see that suffering arises occasionally and is subject to increase and decrease. So these are things that we can establish, we can see in our own lives, or we can observe in an obvious fashion. And suffering itself necessarily is caused. It can't occur events don't occur without causes. And when we see an event like suffering occurring, it's something that occurs occasionally. That is, a particular form of event of suffering is something that occurs on specific occasions. It's not constant and unchanging. And then likewise, suffering is subject to increase and decrease. It waxes and wanes, and that itself establishes that suffering is impermanent, because the events and that the cause of suffering is impermanent, because the result itself, suffering, is impermanent, arising occasionally and subject to increase and decrease.
Oh yeah, 동아 라大白，俺那汤嘛， 사천 년의 본부 동아지 라신도 체네 아니 동아 대단 찬듯이 로당 아니 동아 메데나 동아단 자거나 동아 빵 아니 동아대 빵고거를 동아지 주 말로 발라 아니 저 동아 밀로바 예장 안 주근주라 빵대탕 안 주근주 바베 저 동아 로바 예장 로바 서바인다 아니 고바 동아단 자요 고바다 탐제게 로데 다른 전도 줘
So thus, when we understand it in this way, then this demonstrates how one successively generates the mind that desires freedom from suffering. That is, by understanding what suffering is in its true nature, that produces the desire to be free from it. And likewise, the mind that desires to abandon the origination of that suffering, because once one understands what suffering is, and that suffering necessarily has a cause, that cause necessarily is impermanent, then there necessarily has to be a way to gain freedom from that suffering. And so one it produces the desire to abandon, to get rid of the origin of the suffering, and one develops from that the mind that desires to attain the cessation of suffering. So these understanding suffering produces the wish to be free from suffering, and then the wish to be free from suffering impels one to look for the causes of that suffering, and understanding those causes impels one to seek a freedom from those causes and the resultant suffering, and then that in turn impels one to produces the desire to seek the path and to achieve the cessation of suffering.
Oh yeah, that is la. Kunjung gumiti chola nyabo tabatela. Teju shomji teichi miti chola tabate. Sanamne zawa ra. Oh teju kunjung teju. 가서 군중 대 미대초 대주 동아지 주 군중 동아지 주 군중 대 미대초 님보라 따바자래 대선 님보 단 군중 미대 군중 그 조대 군중 레다 님모니 와 레기나 레다 님모니가 나는 조 님모니 바래 님모는 매광게 레서 태양 조 당지 말봐 샤게 인장 님보라 따바자래디 농아 티 주군종데 아니 다 주군종 당지 말봐데 아니 뭐 다음에 또 비셔가 때네 아니 쇼마쇼고 쇼고고와 인장 데카서렘 대주 준비지 대주 준비 대인이 미디 줘라 잡아서 규용 오버 또 배치 대 미디 총의 줄을 세거나 미디에서 나좀 아니 나좀 말을 밖에 미디 점지 그냥 못해 아니 다음에 또 비셔라 임바다.
So then it continues on page 322 in the translation. It is reasonable that one undertakes an analysis of the antidote, that is the opposing factor to that origination of suffering, because one desires to destroy suffering through reliance upon the antidote to the originating cause of that suffering. So here then the ultimate antidote to suffering is the ultimate source of suffering, origin of suffering, is the misapprehension of the self, which apprehends the self as being real or existing by means of some kind of intrinsic nature or essential nature. And so that root of samsara, or basic source of samsara, is the foundation or fundamental cause of suffering. And once one again ascertains that, it would be reasonable then to undertake an analysis of what the antidote to that origin of suffering is, that cause. And when one does that, then one can come to see that the antidote or counteragent to the misapprehension of the self is the wisdom which understands the absence of a self, that there's no real self or essential self, and so it's reasonable that one should seek to actualize that antidote so as to destroy, to eliminate that cause which gives rise to suffering.
Oh yeah, 다다다바나 군중티 미디 초데 아니 다음에도 배치를 들어가 어디 당진의 미디 대행해와 좋아데 가르래서는 당진 대기 오치다 신도 또바 가시세 당진 대기 가르래서는 아니 다도 좋아 좀 봐. 是吧？然后最近看了没对比，然后大都怎么，当真这个我其他多半看些，第一当真这个我大都出发的，然后大都没出发的。第一简单给老早准备一些的，大没多别落的当真这个简单给老早准备一些的，俺那当真给你没得。哦。
Now then so when one analyzes thus, one also ascertains through authority, through an avenue of valid cognition, that opposing factors to that origination, in order to cognize that the nature of the cause is, Roger translates this as self-grasping. I'm translating this usually as misapprehension of the self. The self here is, in this misapprehension, is apprehending the self as if it were an autonomous thing, that it had its own autonomous character or nature. So it's taking as its object the self and misapprehending that as if it existed in a autonomous or had a kind of intrinsic nature which didn't depend upon anything outside of itself. That autonomy or intrinsic character is the object which is held by this misapprehension of the self. And the antidote to that is the gnosis that grasp, I think, is a bit misleading here. It's which apprehends phenomena in a manner which are opposite to that self-grasping or misapprehension of the self. So what this is referring to here there is that the root of samsara is the misapprehension of the self, holding it to be autonomous when it in fact is not autonomous. So selflessness is excluding that sense of autonomy which the misapprehension of the self superimposes or falsely ascribes to the person or self. And the wisdom which understands selflessness understands the person or self as being free, devoid of that self which is falsely projected upon it, the autonomous self or self existing by means of its own intrinsic nature. The conflation of the actual self with the autonomous or independent self which is falsely ascribed to it by the misapprehension of the self. So then these lines out of the verse then show the antidote is the gnosis, which apprehends things, phenomena, in a manner which is opposite, the contrary of self-grasping. So self-grasping or the misapprehension of the self holds things, persons, selves, all other things, as if they were autonomous or existed by means of their own intrinsic nature. It didn't depend upon anything extrinsic to them, whereas this gnosis apprehends phenomena in the correct fashion, the way they actually exist, which is that they are devoid of that kind of false self-nature which ignorance or the misapprehension of the self falsely superimposes or ascribes to them.
Oh yeah, that tiki, also lamde, and never chawa yamba. Do I shawa? Unjum bawa chawa, Baba undo chawa, lam demba chawa yamba de, and that dancing that in the also gabi, Damato be share of taking him but take it, and it dancing jamba chawa in the lam de demba chawa de. Then it is and then that gets in Java, and he said, the teacher you Chang said, and then that would Zimba, Ranja to it, I do Ranja to it out of Zimbatan. My long Jajang, Tagiwa, and then Ranja to it to Zimba Chevi. And he Zimbe Chevi, Jibby Tija Pumbonga, Jibby Tija Pumbonga, you do Yaba and you do Yaba. Then there you do not like Chabi Seba. 那等的原来就一个拿家的设备等的下游问题嘞，我说，你东啊，让在东啊，啥在你的通报，我是解决的，你到，要是起码个年龄通报，我是解18人咋，那你拿的是比18缺钱，让在东啊，你18的，就要起码个让在东啊，这个主人的提前的时间也没起来。是吧？咱们我什么都同意写了的，你当真提那些空头下巴给，打卡萨给打断打档打给怎么提给，那些人的，我听这个打给怎么提给打都出发了，人家为在都出发怎么？咱们都别落提给，人家特别在意的马出发。太当真当搞有过呢，你当真早呢？咱们多比，我说咱们多比老恐怕狂年狂都拍完了，但呢，你当真的早呢顺情吧，顺情的吧也没写。
So the explanation here continues. The craving mind of desire for suffering, having as its object field the 5 composite aggregates affected by grasping at I and grasping at mine, or misapprehending I and misapprehending mine, is the cause of one's resultant suffering because it is the cooperative condition. So here, this is referring to the craving. One can talk about this in terms of craving, which is the factor of dependent origination, which impels one to take rebirth into a subsequent lifetime. And so that craving mind of desire for suffering, what that's referring to is that craving has as its object, it takes as its object the 5 composite aggregates, or one could translate this as the 5 aggregates which are created by composite or created by karma and mental affliction. It takes that as the 5 aggregates which have been produced through karma and mental affliction, and which they themselves have been affected by the misapprehension or grasping at an I and grasping at a mine. Here, if we take this at the most basic level, the I or mine which is being discussed is the person existing as a self-sufficient substance, a kind of self-sufficient person. When we define the object of the misapprehension of self or misapprehension of I or mine, there are coarser and subtler forms of that. And at the most fundamental level, which is kind of common to all of the different vehicles of Buddhism, all of the different systems of Buddhist philosophy, the notion that the I or the I exists as a self-sufficient substance, that misconception is superimposed on the I and is the object which is grasped at or misapprehended in that way. Or the mine is sort of like taking the aggregates as being the property of that self-sufficient I or person and holding them as if they belong to that self-sufficient I or person. So this, but craving is the basic cause of one's resultant suffering, because it is the cooperative condition. That is, it functions as the cooperative condition that actualizes the process of rebirth and the taking up of the 5 contaminated aggregates when they're appropriated and taken up by the force of karma and mental affliction.
Oh yeah, that's the thing.咱们同样搞完一些的，你这个空的就把天马家吧。你像18天那些在咱们同行业的18天那些的18天那些咱们同行业的，你提居然呢18天个居然那边18天个就看着这啥呢没得吧？ Then I let you Mariba. Mississippi Julian, Majestiba Nichete, Junipemba Chavaji, Tamata Dilaja Yansani, Missidi, Sibijan, Anim, then the Alajuna, Sipa Jokova de Gara, Sipate, Tamataba Jurangoji Jurete. Maribade, and it Juju Shaiza, and it Julian never Chavis, Sipa take it, you Maribala never Chavis.
Nugi Mareti.
But he in the Dametova Indi, Dametova Indi, Dametova Dig, Sibati, Julia never Chavis.
Mariba Sipig
Mariba never chat, Danzim Mariba.
So it continues in saying that the wisdom directly seeing no self or absent non-self is the destroyer of that self-grasping, misapprehension of the self, because it is able to eradicate that misapprehension of the self or self-grasping through a manner of here I'd say apprehending. Grasping doesn't really work to me in this context, obviously. A manner of apprehending phenomena that contradicts that misapprehension of the self. So alternatively, one sees that no self, the understanding of no self, damages or contradicts that craving and applies the words in order to destroy the cause of that. So what is referred to here is that when you're talking about the factors of dependent origination, the limbs of dependent origination or factors of dependent origination, craving serves as the direct cause of the process of rebirth, of the triggering of grasping, the taking up of the aggregates in the subsequent factors of dependent origination. And so now what this verse is saying here is that this misapprehension of the self, which is another name for ignorance. Ignorance is the cause of craving. Now, ignorance in the 12 factors of dependent origination is the first of the 12 factors of dependent origination. So there are intervening factors in the causal stream of dependent origination. But what this is indicating here is that ignorance is not the direct cause of craving, but it's a necessary condition for the arising of craving. So it's a indirect cause of craving, and thus when one understands the selflessness or the absence of an autonomous or a self-sufficient self, then when one understands that, then one directly contradicts ignorance, and because you've directly contradicted and applied the antidote to the cause of craving, you have indirectly but effectively damaged or contradicted the functioning of that craving.
Oh yeah. Siba take Dama to be shared of the Siba take Niji Dama to be shared of the Yende T. Ju Ani Maribal Baina Maribal T. Gila Nebishi Maribal Danzilla Nebishel.
So when the verse says this seeing no self is the destroyer of that, it contradicts that. One can read those lines, that is the word that, in the last line of the verse, in two ways. One, it's the direct antidote to the misapprehension of the self, or grasping at the self as being autonomous or self-sufficient. Because it's the direct antidote of that. Otherwise, one can construe the referent of the word that as a craving, which is but it's an indirect destroyer of that. It destroys the sort of basis for the arising of craving, and stops craving from arising. So one can understand that it means in order to destroy the cause of that, the cause of craving.
Oh yeah, that's it.
We'll stop there for today.
Medo dar